Allow me to welcome you all to this briefing on anticipating the threats of economic warfare subversions. Special thanks are due to Senator Kyle for sponsoring this event and to our distinguished speakers. I've been following the money trail for quite some time, during which I've authored several books. I started in the early 90s with narco-terrorism, followed with Evil Money, showing how political corruption allowed for growing links between international criminal and terrorist organizations, and soon after 9/11, with Funding Evil, how terrorism is financed and how to stop it. This book introduced me personally to a double-pronged economic warfare strategy aiming to impoverish me and all Americans, other Americans, while assaulting our right for free expression. My personal fight led in 2010 to a new preventive law that Senator Kyle supported. Thank you. This law protects American journalists, authors, and publishers from the enforcement of foreign libel judgments, effectively ended this kind of economic warfare. The Economic Warfare Institute is a nonprofit organization dedicated to tracking and analyzing economic threats, especially in the financial sector, that are directed against the United States and other Western democracies by state and non-state actors. More information about what we do is available, the Economic Warfare Institute is available online. This briefing is the first, we hope, in many briefings on the different aspects of economic warfare. It is fitting, therefore, that today we are providing, and today's briefing will provide an initial overview of economic warfare attacks and their potential impacts on key elements of the American economy. EWI is of the strong opinion that threats to the United States economy are the next great field of battle. In fact, we are already at economic war with such state actors as Iran and such non-state actors as Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. The future battlefield is vast. It not only includes the realms of banking and finance, but also cyber, market and currency manipulation, energy, drug trafficking, state-sponsored industrial espionage, and the list can go on and on. EWI believes that this vast potential field of battle, while widely worried and written about, has not been understood as a whole. And we are concerned that if we continue as we have been, we will not be able to recognize the many parts and/or the interrelations between them. We are not privy to what the government does, but we feel that insufficient attention has been paid to anticipating vulnerabilities and taking preventive actions to stop them. Our purpose today is to go out to the cutting edge of the threats we face and to begin a dialogue on how to address them in a sophisticated and methodical fashion. Before I turn the microphone over to Ken Jensen, who will introduce the speakers and moderate this panel, I will give you an example of cutting-edge financial threats to the US economy and its security. On May 6, 2010, the US stock exchange plunged approximately 1,000.9%, only to recover most of those losses in minutes. Still, 2 years later, the joint report by the SEC and the Commodity Future Trading Committee did not rule out terrorism as a possible cause for the May 2010 flash crash. But the entire financial industry still has no uniform explanation why or how this event occurred. Although there is a general agreement that the current market structure based on high-speed trading, dark pools, and fragmentation has been the enabler. There are rumors that the SEC may spend money to create real-time monitoring system. But do they know what they are supposed to be looking for? The new market system is highly electronic, facilitating ultra-high frequency trading, is unregulated and misunderstood. Therefore, making the current market structure vulnerable to attacks. The flash crash of 2010 is evidence of this vulnerability. While the industry does not want another flash crash, it still has not provided a conclusive answer of how it happened, therefore unable to prevent another crash. Direct market access, DMA, is a term used to describe electronic trading facilities that give investors wishing to trade in financial instruments a way to interact with the order book of an exchange, and this plays a key role in increasing the market's vulnerability. Today, DMA is often combined with proprietary algorithmic trading strategies. Many of the leading high-frequency programmers reside in countries such as Ukraine, Romania, India, and such, and are not scrutinized by proper background checks. This opens the door for cyber threats from DMA clients and even by possible sleepers residing at member or broker-dealer firms. Indeed, early identification of financial threats is the subject that the EWI works on for various customers. These include both tabletop exercises and the development of decision aids. Thank you very much. Okay.
I know there are those of you here who might recognize me from my previous lifetimes. I think this is my 6th or 7th sub-career. Most lately, I was executive director of the American Committees on Foreign Relations for a very long time. And before that, I was a founding staff member and most lately director of research at the Peace Institute, before any appropriations for the building you now see on the wall. At any rate, I'm going to moderate from the sidelines today and introduce speakers as they come along. Our first speaker, who sort of puts all the cards on the table for us, I think, is David Hamon. David feels more like a colleague than anything else to me, because over the past several years, he's been integrally involved with the work of the Economic Warfare Institute, was upon a time on its board of directors. David is now Distinguished Analyst of Analytic Services Distinguished Analyst for Analytic Services, in other words, ANSWER. Prior to that, he was Director for Strategic Research and Dialogues at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. I'm sorry I'm stumbling over this because I wanted to remember DTRA. Many of you know what DTRA is. At any rate, David will address us on future threats.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, especially Senator Kyle and his staff, and the American Center for Democracy for allowing me to present my thoughts on the subject. Speaking of DTRA, it was a big joke in my office. I'd get a call once a day from somebody, either they knew me or not, and they would ask me at the beginning of the phone conversation how much I'd contributed to reducing the threat that day. So quantification of threat was something interesting. These thoughts are my own, and they don't reflect my company or any of our clients. About 7 years ago, whilst I was the Director of Research for the Advanced Systems and Concepts Offices, which was set up by John Hamry in 1998 in DTRA to be an in-house think tank. I initiated a research inquiry at the time to look at what the next generation of weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass effect would be. It resulted in several spin-off inquiries. It was quite an interesting little exercise. The best part of it was I wasn't responsible for implementing any of it, just capturing the thoughts and sending it on down the stream. It's important to note the distinction between WMD and WME. WMD is thought of as traditional nuclear, biological, chemical, radiological, and high explosive threats, whereas weapons of mass effect is a little more social science, squishy-like, which we used to keep the definition that it was non-traditional weapons, including weapons inducing mass terror designed to attack some aspect of society. One study I oversaw in particular, which I enjoyed and really piqued my interest, and I've been trying to follow these last few years when I had the opportunity, was the question at what point the terrorist organizations, as we knew them then, as we know them now, might evolve, they and their state sponsors might evolve from creating kinetic kill terrorist actions to attacking the Western economic system. Is it possible that warfare in the future may involve actions either taken by a state adversary or a non-state adversary, specifically designed at activities to damage the U.S. economy and the Western economic system? Our thinking back then in my little group and those that we used to do some of this research didn't evolve enough to take into account the generational changes in offensive cyber and other technologically induced systemic attacks. If anything, as we shall see today from the panel that you're going to hear, this aspect of the problem has gotten much worse. For example, if stealth viruses can be used to attack military systems, defense systems, with the purpose to create physical destruction or to cripple capability, then imagine what can be done if these same viruses were turned into the economic and financial systems. So I have but a short time in this presentation, so let me list several observations and make some points on the future threat environment. First, the observations. I'm going to use acronyms EW and ET to stand for economic warfare, economic terrorism, in the interest of time. So first observation, the experts we consulted back in 05 when we had a little small get-together on the subject of economic terrorism, they were unable to come to a consensus on the aspect of whether it was a real threat and whether the threat was real. In fact, they were divided. The government experts and the terrorist experts, those who do terrorist research, and we all know who they are, so I won't go into it, doubted that terror organizations had the ability and sophistication to evolve toward economic terrorism as a weapon of choice, certainly not in one generation. However, interestingly enough, the private sector folks, and these people were spread across a number of different industries, felt that they were not only vulnerable then, this was 2005, but they freely discussed their concerns in this Chatham House environment conference I'd set up. Unfortunately, we didn't discuss progress/conduct on the research of state-sponsored economic warfare, simply because it was a little bit beyond the scope of the meeting. Hopefully we'll get into that today a little bit. Next point, the insurance industry experts felt, in addition to more 9/11 incidents, that mass panic-induced psychological terror would not only strain their resources to the breaking points, but it was something they were betting on, predicting back in 2005. In fact, mass terror-induced economic attacks was decided by this group of people that look at risk for these companies and decide how much insurance they should have on their own, as the biggest threat they had in the future. I would kind of define this as an attack designed to drive human behavior in a massive way that would end up doing some kind of harm to the economic system. Second observation, agricultural industries were especially believed to be vulnerable, that ranging from disease-induced food production to attacks on the supply chain. Next observation, U.S., because it is so big, represents a target-rich environment across the whole front for either ET or EW. Public reaction is the key. Bolt out of the blue attacks would likely have a cascading effect, be difficult for government to manage. It was generally believed that to be successful, a campaign of tactical maneuvers or smaller attacks would be needed because the economy was believed to be too resilient. So the question here would be, again, if this is 2005, these pinprick attacks, would you be able to spot it? On the open source side, that is the unclassified side of gathering information, economic jihad is possible, likely. And if it hasn't occurred, given at the time that's taken place in the intervening years Doesn't mean it's not going to happen, and I would say, based on what we can read in the open source, to just give it time. Much jihadi literature contains many references to attacking economic symbols and systems. I think Rachel's written about that quite a bit. And lastly, the big observation as a takeaway to this get-together is preparing countermeasures are extremely difficult. More on that a bit later. Now, a few points on the future threat environment. First and foremost, including how to identify targets. The most important part of this, in my estimate, is unless there's a serious and immediate public-private partnership created to work on this problem, we have virtually no way of knowing if what we are seeing coming at us is an attack or a criminal activity, a hacker, a group of hackers that are in it for fun-seeking activity, an anarchistic event for the purpose of creating anarchy, or some sort of cascading technological failure. And as a corollary to this, essentially, as opposed to the sort of mission spaces that we're all used to working in the Defense Department and from my military background, the big question is, who owns the economy? Who's the keeper of the economy in the first place? If some entity attacks private international financial systems, for example, is this a national security threat, or is this their problem? Finally, what's the role of the public? Should they be informed? Should they be educated on the threat and help to provide the resiliency blanket that we all need to look at? The same thing we talked about back after 9/11 with the kinetic destructions. My thinking here is that the government did a pretty good job of educating the American public in the 50s about nuclear weapon use in the United States, and some of that could be useful today. Second, EWT attacks that are kinetic cannot be ruled out, even in a digital age. Essentially, research points to four types of future attacks: traditional kinetic, innovative use of cyber and or spoofing, traditional WMD, and long campaigns combining multiple attacks at narrow targets to prolong economic damage. Third, in an age of cyber, which we're going to hear about later, there are many ways to damage/attack economic/financial systems for kinetic effect, to destroy digital systems, to deliberately steal or divert economic assets, to spoof or obfuscate in a manner that creates panic, loses confidence in institutions and governments and security organizations, and masks real intent. The entire domain of cyber used in this manner as a weapon of EWET is not well understood as a threat, especially for the economic domain. This also includes disinformation campaigns as well. Fourth, it's not very clear, even if an attack is labeled as a bona fide attack, what's to be done about it? What are the motivations and intent of such an attack? Is it an act of war that draws a military response? What exactly is the role of the defense and military forces of this country, for example, in an economic warfare or economic terror campaign? Do we think differently about this if the source of the threat comes from a state? If states either wittingly with helping non-state groups or in a deliberate campaign are trying to undermine our economy? Are we certain that the government of this state is behind it, or are these bad actors? Does cyberspace behavior that includes attacks on economic systems merit some kind of an arms control approach to sort of manage the cyber common spaces? Will that work? And lastly, on that question is these attacks deterrable? Is this something we can reach back into the classic deterrence theory and use as a way of coming up with a countermeasure? Fifth, work must be begun now on a suite of countermeasures that take into account a wide variety of proportional responses and system resiliency. And here these things need to be exercised at the interagency and at the with our friends from the private sector in order to be effective. And this is one of those learn as you go things. We need to do it over and over again so that we understand what we're facing. Sixth, and I would not rule out in the future attacks on agricultural production in some form, although interestingly enough, my analysis has led me to conclude that the movement to buy organic, buy local, buy from small farms, at least in this country, may have mitigated some of the food chain vulnerability issues. There are still many threats related to agriculture, food, animal production, especially from overseas, as well as distribution. Finally, my last point, one of the most important aspects of the threat space is the existing environment, one we all live in now. If the economy is perceived, either here in this country or across the Atlantic and across the Pacific to our friends in Japan and other the big economies of the G20 states, if the economies are perceived as suffering from a number of failures of various kind, and obviously you know what comes to mind here in the European Union, and may be exacerbated by poor leadership of these countries, then this pre-existing damage and weakness will be part of the attacker's calculus. Well, I thank you for your time, and I look forward for the questions later.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is General Hayden, who probably needs not much of an introduction. He is now a partner at Chertoff Associates, former director of CIA and of the National Security Agency. He's going to talk to us about the cyber nightmare.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to come and share a few thoughts. When I looked at the batting order that we had here this afternoon, I knew we were going to get very detailed, great expertise on an awful lot of threads. And so I decided I didn't want to compete with that, and I was going to take the option of stepping back a little bit and trying to project a bit into the future and to suggest that, you know, this could actually get a lot worse if we're not careful. And I submitted my title as something along the lines of the most dangerous tools in the most dangerous hands. Right? And now you'll hear me echo a few things that David said already, and I think I'm going to foreshadow some of the things that will follow me. But hear me out. I come to you as an American GI, 39 years in the Department of Defense. And I think most of you who follow this understand that in our Department of Defense, we look upon the cyber thing as a domain. We do land, sea, air, space, cyber. It's a place where you want us to go to defend you. It's a place where we will go to conduct operations. But like those other domains, land, sea, air, space, it has its own peculiar characteristics. Inherently strategic, inherently global, characterized by great speed, characterized by great maneuverability. And because of its inherent characteristics, for me, as a military man, practically every advantage goes to the attacker, just by the nature of the domain in which we're operating. And yet, you and I include myself in that, attracted by the convenience, speed, ubiquity of this thing, have decided to put stuff that you and I formerly kept in a safe or in our wallet out there into this domain, which I've already told you is very, very hard to defend. The line I jotted down was such a combination of insecurity and indispensability we have probably not seen before. Now, when I talk about things going on in this domain, I usually divide them into sins and sinners. So let me run through my catalog of sins, and these will be touched on later by some of the other speakers. The first is just stealing your stuff, right? What we would technically call computer network exploitation, espionage, okay? An accepted international activity for centuries, just made far more enabled by the nature of the cyber domain. And then there's computer network attack for cyber effect. Estonia, 2007, patriotic Russian hackers collapsing the Estonian internet system. Apparently those same patriots did the same thing to Georgia in August of 2008, all right? Collapsing the Georgian internet system. Cyber for cyber effect, but not just stealing your stuff, causing damage. And then finally, one classic example out there now is Stuxnet, which whoever conducted the attack did something that's never been done before, using a weapon comprised of ones and zeros to actually create physical destruction in one of those other domains. So I feel like a a line, remember that old cop show, Hill Street Blues? Got to be careful out there. Well, there are a lot of dangers out there, from stealing your stuff to affecting your network or now creating physical destruction. Those are the sins. Who are the sinners? And here's where I really want to emphasize what I think is the point I'm trying to bring. Let me do this from most to least capable. I think the most capable sinners out there by far are nation states. They know what they're doing. By and large, nation states are out there for the intelligence value. Nation states are out there doing what we call CNE, computer network exploitation, the cyber espionage thing. It's not that nation states don't think about doing some other stuff. To recall the press accounts before the NATO military action in Libya, where there appears to have been speculation as to whether or not we wanted to physically destroy the Libyan air defense system or simply to use a cyber attack to enable it. All right? So state actors out there. Now look, I know state actors can be very destructive, and I'm creative enough to doodle on the back of an envelope to think of a state actor or two, Iran, North Korea, who could act incredibly irresponsibly, almost without limit, in the cyber domain if they perceive themselves to be provoked in a certain way. But frankly, even though deterrence doesn't work in the cyber place as well as it does in the others, I think absent total war, there are rough limits on state activity in the cyber domain. Okay? Bad, capable, but there are consequences, and that might limit what they could do. Remember, most dangerous tools, most dangerous hands. Second category are criminals. They do it for profit. They're stealing not your data, but your money. They're stealing your wealth. Frankly, they've got a symbiotic relationship with their victim. Okay? It's rare in nature where a parasite decides to destroy its host. And so, although criminals are bad and we're suffering greatly from them, I don't think criminals go out there to destroy the American banking system. They're living off of it. They're profiting from its continued existence. Which now brings me to, I think, the most dangerous hands. And that's that third group that David already suggested. And it's very hard to kind of label them. They could be terrorists, they could be hackers, they could be activists, they could be anarchists, but they're all living off of the peculiar empowerment that this new cyber thing is giving to individuals. And currently, frankly, they're the least capable in this taxonomy. I don't mean to offend them, I really don't, because I want to be able to use my computer tonight, all right? But an awful lot of what they do and gets the headlines, in the physical domain, we'd call cyber graffiti or a cyber picket line in terms of what it is they do. But as all of these actors act, as the world becomes more sophisticated with these tools, the water level for all three of these groups gets higher in the harbor. All boats begin to rise. And so my nightmare scenario is that this third group, currently least capable but also least responsible, least limited, least influenced by consequences, over a period of time, probably not measured in months but not measured in decades either, begin to acquire the skills and the tools we currently associate with nation states. And I leave it to your imagination as to what would trigger this third group so empowered to do things without limits, to do things catastrophic that really do begin to cause the walls to start tumbling down. It all suggests to me that there's much, much work to be done to make this thing so indispensable and so insecure, perhaps a bit more secure, before we meet these two trend lines. Again, the most dangerous tools merging with the most dangerous hands. Thank you.
Our next speaker is yet another former CIA director, Tim Woolsey. Needs not much introduction, I think. You're all probably more familiar with him these days, his work on energy, turning oil into salt. And Jim is going to talk about the impact of oil on economic warfare.
Some 40 years ago, there was burglary in Washington over at the Watergate, and it gave rise, among many other things, to the best advice I know of ever with respect to understanding wrongdoing, and that is Deep Throat's famous line, "Follow the money." And in order to understand why the bad guys have the money to run their dark pools and their naked short selling and their economic jihad and all the rest, we need to understand why it is they are so rich. And the reason they are rich is oil, almost entirely oil. Oil dominates, monopolizes world transportation. Only about 5% of world transportation is not on some oil fuel. A few trolleys, some Olympic rowing eights, fox hunts, and that's about it. Don't run on oil. Everything else essentially does. And over 3/4 of the world's oil, 78% to be exact, of the conventional reserves of conventional oil, are in the hands of OPEC. A cartel, conspiracy and restraint of trade of 12 countries, 8 in the Middle East, 2 in sub-Saharan Africa, 2 in South America. That cartel, should anyone need any proof that it is a cartel, that it is a conspiracy and restraint of trade, couple of quick facts. In 1972, at the time of Watergate, 40 years ago, eve of the Yom Kippur War, OPEC was pumping about 31 million barrels of oil a day. The world has gone through a lot of halting, but nonetheless real economic growth over the course of the last 40 years, and today's worldwide GDP is around double, some would say close to 3 times, but let's be conservative, around double what it was 40 years ago. OPEC is still pumping 31 million barrels of oil a day. They pumped less in many of the intervening years because, being a cartel, they drop production when they want to get price up. But 31 million barrels is what they want to pump, and that's what they are pumping. Now, if you have an organization that controls 3/4 or more than 3/4 of a vital substance, and it sells on the market every day about a little less than 1/3 of that vital substance's market, oil's market, and if it's got is pumping 31 million barrels a day, same as it was when the world's economies and GDP and oil demand was about half what it is now, there's really no other conclusion you can draw than that it is a conspiracy and restraint of trade. Now, this is not new. That phrase comes from the antitrust laws, which were, of course, Teddy Roosevelt's response to an earlier conspirator in restraint of trade named John D. Rockefeller. Most admirable man in some ways, but there was no doubt Standard Oil was a cartel, massive one. Roosevelt broke it in his own way by moving the world oil market, and the American oil market in particular, toward competition. Oil today, for all practical purposes, either the monopoly or OPEC's dominance of the trade, does not have competition. We need to understand what that means. Among the things it means is that almost all of the oil states are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Why is that so? 22 countries in the world have 60% or more of their national incomes that come from oil and gas. All 22 are in Freedom House's category of not free. They are all dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. there are some it's exactly 9 of the 10 largest oil exporting countries in the world that are also autocracies or dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Only nice Norway is out of place in there in the top 10. Canada's 11th, so 9 of 10 or 9 of 11 are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. What is going on? Paul Collier, professor at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, head of the African Economics Institute, is the originator, I believe, of the phrase the oil curse. And as Collier points out, it's not just oil. It's any commodity which is absolutely essential to some key operation in the world and in which a country comes into a massive amount of it. By discovering it, by one war, by one way or another. It happened with gold in Spain in the 16th century, etc. What happens? If there is a huge amount of economic rent in that commodity, that is income well over and above what would be a reasonable return on capital and labor, when that rent comes into an autocratic totalitarian structure, it goes to the elites. They get richer, they get more powerful. What happens if a lot of oil is discovered by Canada or Norway? Not much. Nice democracies with free economies, they just get richer, like Alaska. But they don't become dictatorships. But the ones that already are, the autocracy is added to. So we have a situation in which we are indirectly, by our oil thirst, promoting dictatorship and autocracy and its embedding around the world. And we're doing one or two other things as well. We borrow approximately $1 billion a day, the United States does, to import oil. That means that we are paying a tax of something in the neighborhood of $4,000 per year per American family, and that tax does not go to Washington to pay the Marine Corps or to Annapolis to pay for roads in Maryland. That tax goes in the pockets of Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc. Does it matter that we're getting away from buying oil from some of these places and we buy most of our oil from Canada? A little bit. Helps Canada's balance of payments. That's a good thing. They're a nice country. But there's one worldwide oil market. So basically, if we buy more from Canada and less from Saudi Arabia, somebody else is going to buy more from Saudi Arabia and less from Canada. So we are not solving the problem by just buying more oil from some different place. Oil, over the long run, is fungible. There's some differences with trade patterns and refinery types and sulfur content and such. But generally speaking, we are not doing anything that useful. And with respect, by buying from one country rather than another, and with respect to buying from American producers, drill baby drill, that's good from the point of view of our balance of payments. It'd be great if we only had to borrow $900 million a day instead of $1 billion a day. But that's all we're accomplishing by drilling domestically in oil. As long as oil dominates world transportation, and as long as OPEC is the conspiracy and restraint of trade that controls the oil market, and as long as oil has a huge amount of economic rent attached to it, we, under our current knuckling under to it, our lack of willingness to have other ways to drive compete with it, the rigidity that our cars, we're not addicted to oil, but our cars are, they can't drive on anything except petroleum products. As long as we let that happen, we will continue to boost the content of the coffers of the Saudi Arabias, the Irans, and elsewhere, who are the source of the dark pools, of the naked short selling, and all the rest. We will not solve our economic warfare problems, cyber or otherwise, until we destroy not modify, destroy oil's monopoly over transportation and OPEC's control of the oil market.
I should have mentioned that Jim Woolsey is a member of the board of directors of the American Center for Democracy and Economic Warfare Institute. Now we move on to Daniel Heath, who's the managing director for North America at Maxwell Stamp PLC and a former executive director alternate of the International Monetary Fund. He's going to talk about financial warfare, policy practice, and the vulnerabilities of U.S. finance.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Kyle and Rachel and the Institute for organizing this important event. It's important to my perspective because there are growing opportunities for financial warfare, and in the area of financial warfare is very different from the traditional economic warfare that we're all familiar with, even the dirty tricks of counterfeiting your enemy's money in time of war. And financial warfare is inherently susceptible to cyber attack, the drama that you've heard about. But then we shudder every day when we read about like the 75 billion a couple weeks ago that just disappeared from accounts, or the flash crash, or any number of things in our popular imagination. But another perspective on financial warfare involves the common vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities that arise from familiar events and conditions, in a sense, the threats that are hiding in plain sight, given the right circumstances. Economics is seen to be such a boring area of endeavor, so indulge me if we engage in a little bit of fantasy for a minute and find some use in that fantasy to get our imaginations working on security. In mid-2014, a certain Asian country holding over $4 trillion in U.S. Official and agency debt announces that it will exchange $1 or $2 trillion for exclusive food production rights in California and mineral rights in Alaska. After this settles in a little bit, capital starts to flee from the United States. Between Christmas and New Year's, the week of holiday in Washington, a gigantic storm hits the East Coast. Electricity is gone, which we're familiar with here in Washington. Not unthinkable. At which time, some suspected sabotage occurs on the metro system, on some other infrastructure involving transport, which is fairly shut down anyway because of the snow. Assassinations occur, a couple of them. They appear to be random, like the sniper attack in 2001 after 9/11. And some of them go after high-value targets, like the heads of some investment banks in New York, or Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Throw in a little biochemical attack, like the unsolved anthrax of 2001. An attack on a water supply that doesn't kill anybody, but it just means no one can use the water because, fortunately, in the case of Washington, the Corps of Engineers is found it in time. But my point is, these are all familiar events. They're all not unthinkable. They're all realistic, and they're all possible. And they all cause panic, and they all cause a loss of confidence in the financial system and in our security system. And this is not good for the economy. As David Hamon pointed out, confidence is severely impaired. Or consider another scenario. This comes from a Pentagon report released last year, where certain shadowy parties manipulated the price of oil to rise in 2007, in the wake of which it manipulated through CDS market and dark pool action, the bear rate on Bear Stearns, and ultimately on Lehman, leading to what we all know, the gigantic debt spiral that we're living with. which kind of shoots our wad so that when the real financial attack occurs in a few months, we have no powder left. Ultimately, the renminbi ends up as the reserve currency, global reserve currency. Something, again, that's not unthinkable, as already moves are underway. They are working on convertibility, on exchange rate flexibility. The IMF has discussed with them, including the renminbi in the SDR basket. These are all realistic, and you can adjust or substitute other events, or if you think one is wrong, stick in another one. There's plenty to play with. They're not particularly cyber-oriented. They kind of wait for the target, that is US finance, to appear in its sights rather than attack at the wrong time. The US financial sector is a prize. It's got a larger role in the US economy than ever before. It was 2.8% of GDP in 1950. It's 8.5 in 2010, slightly down to 8.4 last year. It's also, while deep and innovative and very large, it's also concentrated, it's obscure, its practices. It's instituted dependency of the real economy, the manufacturing economy, on finance. You remember in 2008 how Secretary Paulson and Ben Bernanke went to the Congress, said we might not have an economy after this weekend because corporate paper was all frozen up, because people couldn't understand counterparty risks. Nobody knew who to trust. The whole thing was on the verge of collapse, as stated by the two officials whose task is to stabilize markets in the United States traditionally. U.S. money trade has surpassed real trade in goods and merchandise. It's now finance a direct source of GDP rather than just a facilitator of growth, which is its traditional economic role, rather than a producer of growth, a facilitator of growth by efficient allocation of resources. And it's become more susceptible than anything else in the U.S. economy. Now, we think every day about two big Wall Street events. 9/11, it was a Wall Street event. It was I remember reading at the time, everyone surmised it was the reason that attack was made there. And the other one, 2008, the meltdown that we're still living with. It's interesting to compare the two. The first was a traditional guerrilla military attack by an external enemy. It was had a single non-discretionary target, in the sense that there's nothing much you could do about the World Trade Center except have a more modest building or live in caves or something. It was intelligible to Americans. It was possible because procedures, fairly simple procedures, failed, and they enabled this to happen. And the target was attractive for symbolic reasons, but there was a real attempt to have an impact, we understand, on the real economy. It failed. There was little damage to U.S. confidence. In fact, we kind of roared after 9/11. 2008, this is an internal, in a sense, self-generated or self-inflicted event by systemic conditions and practices. Procedures allowed it, maybe a regulatory failure, but complex products, counterparty risks, things not understood, things that were mysterious to most Americans and had obscure origins. Indeed, we've had an inquiry into it and still can't get a unified story about what happened and why. Everyone's got a version. But it was an aggregation of discretionary problems, little issues, little reasons, little regulations. The target is hugely important, the U.S. economy, and it had huge impact on the real economy. I don't need saying that, do I? And it's greatly damaged U.S. confidence. In fact, economists look at why, just as an aside, why is it now neither austerity nor deficit spending and stimulus have much effect wherever they're tried? Well, they do work in some places. They've looked at some countries where they work. The thing they find out is that one or the other can work, but it depends. It really requires a high degree of confidence and trust in the government going into the event. And if that's lacking, as it is in the United States, or as it could be lacking, when after a orchestrated attack, these things don't work in the normal way, if at all. The 2008 event is significant, more significant to the economy. It led to wider, longer damage. Both involved familiar things that were used, in a sense, as weapons to hurt the United States. Both of them are likely. They have great potential to devastate, in part because the financial sector has just grown so large. Big difference is 9/11 is seen as a terrorist act, and the 2008 is not, so far as we know. Although there is suspicion that there may be enemy interests who are playing at the margins in that, if not actually orchestrating it. There are theories about this. But what if the terrorists really wanted to engineer a 2008 meltdown? Is it possible? How would the financial sector react, on the other hand, if a mass weapon attack occurred on a major hub like New York City? Is enough being done to make resilient the sector, so that a cascading set of failures would not be contagious or spread to other markets? Could a different kind of terrorist attack succeed in destabilizing our financial sector and impair the real economy? Now, there are many ways of evaluating this. I put some of them on this chart that may have been handed out to you, and I'm going to cruise it very, very briefly. And this is just a suggestive matrix, and it shows the kind of vulnerabilities on the left side that we could do something about, and then the mitigations going out to the right, and they grow from preemptive action to defense action and then restoration type of action. I'm not going to go through these things, are pretty familiar, but you can see on the policy side, large foreign debt with an intervention there of reducing it, and the size and concentration of the finance sector. And there are plenty of proposals about decentralization. This is too big to fail, and what to do about too big to fail. And may I just say, from an economist standpoint, a healthy sector doesn't really like to, doesn't really want to entertain the question of too big to fail. A healthy sector has market entrance and market departures constantly. There are births and deaths of firms. It's not a case of where certain oligopolistic firms dominate and must be saved at all costs. Capital flows, strategic assets, I don't want to take too much time, but these are, the main thing to say about this, these are all policies that can be addressed. These are things that can be done in the preemptive way to reduce our financial vulnerability. Going to the second one, these are financial firms' practices. They're familiar, the CDS, the naked short selling, dark pools, off-exchange sales and trading, derivatives, high-frequency trade. The liquidity swap is a new idea that hasn't really emerged yet about how to get around collateral, new higher collateral requirements. My point is there's ways to address all of these things, including the Section 342 in the Dodd-Frank bill, which tries to establish a more inclusive financial sector, that is one that's more open, that's not so clubby, that's has more of the hallmarks of a healthy sector with entrance and departures. And the real thing I want to focus on is the last bit, the synergistic cases. And the reason for that is that this is where you really get to confidence. When a cumulative impact of small familiar events, leveraging relatively minor familiar conditions into something significant. It's a bit like the automobile. We're told how the automobile wasn't really invented. It's just that certain people aggregated technologies that were kind of lying around. They were all known, they were there, and they had to be put together in a certain way, and something very clever and very important with huge impact was the result. And so too, the way things are put together, the sequence in which they happen can have great impact. The big impact, as I say, is on confidence and on trust. The financial sector is built on this. The role in economics of confidence and trust has been underappreciated. Keynes wrote about animal spirits, and there are other references. But what are the tipping points from a security standpoint? How large do these attacks on confidence have to be to have a real impact? And under what kind of economic conditions? What kind of political conditions? And different debt levels, biochemical attacks. What will it take to freeze the system worse than it did in 2008 when we saw an attack on confidence? In that final section on the paper, the synergistic impacts, the first one is for the finance industry proper, that is, as a sector by itself, and the second one is when talking about the finance of the real economy, which may be a real more impact. And I say that these are more complicated. They feed back to each other, where a good public image of resilience will ward off attack because it's a deterrent. And if the plans are known, like a kind of a stress test for financial vulnerability, we apply stress tests for bank operations under different economic circumstances. Well, why not have a stress test for financial vulnerability to terrorist attack? And anyway, there are various proposals like this that can be backup liquidity plans, a second source of money in time of dire cyber attack that will give assurance to the players in the economy. More study is needed, more inventory and specificity and measurement of the risks, and the design interventions are needed. Domestic financial vulnerability is a prism through which to view economic policy and structure and industry practices. Thank you very much.
For those of you who may be wondering, we will produce a publication from this event, and cyber vulnerability, but it also has to do with the politics of those who are sinned against and the sinners, as Jim Woolsey has pointed out. Our next speaker is Stewart Baker, who is a partner at Steptoe & Johnson, former Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, and the author of a book that I plan to read soon called Skating on Stilts. Stewart will be talking about state-sponsored cyber espionage.
You don't have to read it, just buy it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about cyber espionage. I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 topics. How bad it is, why I think it's going to get much worse, and what we need to do if we're going to stop it or control it. A response that is more serious than we have made today without significantly changing current law. So how bad is it now? I almost feel like everybody here knows how bad it is. There's nothing classified about it. The Dalai Lama network attack is still basically what's happening to all of us. People get into your network by sending you an email that you want to open. You open the email. Your security system has no objection to it, but in fact, it compromises your network, and the attackers upload equipment into your network, into your computer. It turns on your camera. It watches you at your desk. It listens, turns on your mic and listens to you at your desk. It records your every keystroke so it knows what you're thinking as you formulate the thoughts. It is the full 1984 package, except you had to buy the equipment. That's bad. Okay, so why do I think it's going to get worse? First, because the people who are doing this, mostly large states, have mainly used it for a couple of purposes. They're doing espionage against the US government, well, duh, you'd sort of expect that. And they're doing it against a number of companies that have state-sponsored competitors. And mostly what they do is they look for the low-hanging fruit for intelligence, which is, I'm going to have a negotiation with these guys. Can you find out what their negotiating position is and what their bottom line is? And that is routinely extracted from the networks of companies and their corporate advisors, like law firms like mine. That's one thing. And the other thing is they look for big secrets, really cool technology we can steal that we can use, give to our state-sponsored companies who will build competitive products. Those are obvious and effective and very dangerous things that are happening right now, but it will get worse. spent time in the intelligence community, the more time you spend with a particular intelligence capability, the more the customer comes to understand what that capability is, the more they can fine-tune what they want the intelligence collectors to get for them. So they aren't just going to be getting negotiating positions and big technology. What they want to know is, who are your salesmen calling on next week? And what do they think those prospects want? And what prices are they going to be offering them so that they can get in there beforehand or after with a slightly better offer, so that they have hollowed out every tactical advantage you have in the marketplace. That's going to happen as state-sponsored enterprises learn to task the collectors effectively. That's bad, but it's going to be worse. And Rachel is a perfectly appropriate sponsor for this, because, you know, totalitarianism is mostly dead outside of North Korea. And instead, we have a whole bunch of authoritarian governments that have had to work within a kind of quasi-open system in which they don't have total control of the information, but they have an enormous amount of information about their users, about who's online, who's doing what, and they've learned to more or less achieve their goals in a context of something that resembles a democratic, open exchange of information. Those tools, the tools they've learned to kind of work within a veneer of democracy, are exactly the tools they can use against real democracies to change the debates that we have, to punish people who say things that they don't like. We actually heard General Hayden say, I'd like to make sure my computer worked tonight. Maybe I shouldn't say this. Now, that was mostly a joke, but imagine if we knew that people were listening, and that when we went home tonight, we would pay a price depending on what we said in terms of being able to get online and communicate, or whether our refrigerator had been turned off remotely or not. Any number, mine gets turned off by the power company on a regular basis these days. But the idea that people can be punished in fine-tuned ways is increasingly going to be part of the mechanisms by which other countries control the democracies that they are contending with. And not just that. Last campaign was the first one in which it was acknowledged that both campaigns had been compromised by foreign espionage services. As far as we know, nothing happened with that, but most countries know which party they want to have win the next election. So what's going to stop a country that actually is confident about its ability to read this country and the campaign from deciding that one campaign won't have secrets? Well, I remember DebateGate when it was thought that Jimmy Carter's debate preparation materials had gone to Ronald Reagan. It was a disaster. Everybody was very upset about it. Imagine that happening on a regular basis because one country would prefer that one party win that election. We can't really stop that on current technology. So this will get worse as people get better and more confident about using cyber espionage as a tool to influence governments. If you're like me, that makes you deeply unhappy and eager to do something about it. So what can we do? And here I would say, first, one thing that isn't going to work is defending our networks is not going to solve our problems. So we can defend our networks so the cows come home. As General Hayden said, all the advantages are with the offense. They will get in. And if we are counting just on defense, we're toast. So what do we have to do? There's a really interesting bit of kind of psychobiology that in which it's actually been tested, and a reward center has been found in the human brain that fires when people punish others at great cost to themselves for violating the rules. So there's an elaborate study where they give somebody money and they let him send it next door, and if the other guy stiffs him, they give him more money and let him pay that to hurt the other guy, so it costs him money to hurt the other guy, and people do that willingly, and if you put them in an MRI, you can see their reward center fire. You don't really need all of that. You just need to drive in Washington for 2 days and you see that. But it is a challenge to people who believe that Darwin was right. How is it that we have a biological mechanism for requiring us to take action that hurts us just to hurt somebody else? That does not make evolutionary sense unless you believe that the human evolutionary advantage, the thing that made us successful, was our ability to form groups and enforce the rules inside that group so that we could engage in large-scale social organization, which I think is in fact the case. So we have got to find ways to punish people who violate the rules that we choose to enforce as part of our society. And the answer we get from the intelligence community when we say, punish these guys, is, whoa, we can't find them, we don't know who they are, we can't attribute this. I'm going to argue, and this is the first of my solutions, that's wrong. We know a lot about these guys. As we have watched them in our networks, we've learned a lot about them. We've found some of their intermediate servers where they're downloading stuff. We find information about them. We know whether they learned on Linux or Windows. We know whether they're left-handed or right-handed. We know what their tactics are. We know what hours they work. Turns out it's 9 to 5 Beijing time. We know a lot about these guys. Yeah. Yeah, it is a short day. I'm surprised. What we haven't been able to do is actually track this back because we don't know enough about the environment in which they're operating. We can't find them. We can just find these clues to who they are, but we can't find them out in the real world. And so my first suggestion is, if somebody is going to conduct massive, indiscriminate cyber espionage against everybody in the United States, it's time to say, that's what we're going to do for you too. Your country, we want to map your social graph for you. We'll kind of keep it in our classified systems, but we're going to try to compromise every computer in your country, every smartphone in your country, extract all of the data about who those folks are interacting with, and then match it up with what we already know about the attackers to see if we can't put a name and a face and a phone number on the people who are attacking us. I think this is doable. We're not doing it. So that's one thing we could do to find the collectors. A second thing that I would suggest we think about doing is unleashing some of the private sector resources that I see in my practice. I advise companies that have been hacked like this, and they, 3/4 of the time or more, they find out not because they find the hackers in their networks, but because somebody from the US government shows up and says, by the way, we found a terabyte of your data halfway across the Pacific. And then they start looking and they find something, and they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a month trying to figure out all the places these guys are, and then they come in one weekend, a big spasm of activity. They try to stop up every rat hole and throw the guys off the network, which lasts until some idiot in the organization opens another spearphishing email. So it is an endless and unproductive effort to defend their way out of this problem. They would be delighted to go tracking back these collectors, to hack back into systems that the attackers are using. And they would spend their money to figure out who's getting their stuff. Now, that's illegal. Only problem, it's illegal for a private sector person to do. It's not illegal for the US government to do. We do that all the time. But we don't have, frankly, the resources to pursue every single act of corporate espionage enabled by cyber attacks that occurs. And so there's a wonderful, peanut butter chocolate moment here. The US government has the authorities. The private sector that is under attack has the funds. Why not bring those two together and let certain kinds of private investigations of attacks occur under US government supervision, but using resources provided by the private sector? That's the second thing we could be doing about tracking collectors and finding ways to punish them. Two more, and then I'll stop. Different target. We're really focused on the collectors, the guys who are breaking into our systems and taking our stuff. And you know, it's pretty aggravating. But the fact is that, you know, stealing stuff, and again, this comes out of the intelligence community, stealing secrets is no great shakes unless you've got somebody who can actually use it, a consumer who really wants it and will use it effectively. So who are the consumers at the other end of this massive indiscriminate attack, a cyber espionage attack on US companies and the US government? Well, in many cases, these are going to have to be, for this intelligence to be any damn good at all, these parties are going to have to be consumers of intelligence. And that's something that we can do much more of. Let's see. We can sanction consumers who have engaged in intelligence gathering by saying these consumers are a better target than the collectors themselves. If we can find a way to get at the consumers and hurt them, then we're going to do a much better job of punishing people for their misdeeds. Now, what kind of sanctions can we impose? Well, one thing we can do is we can impose trade sanctions on the consumers, the companies who are actually using this information. So private sector, state-sponsored entities are going to be the people who are using this intelligence, and we need to find them. If we find them, first, their defenses will be less good than the collectors because they're in business. They're not in the collection business. They're in the oil business or the high-speed rail business. So if we can find ways to break into their system, it's going to be easier than breaking into the systems of the collectors. Second, those state-sponsored enterprises that are using this information have to use it outside of their home country. They're going to be taking that to other countries. They're going to be engaging in business in other countries, which means that they're subject to the legal regimes of other countries. So that you can say, if I can find the evidence that these consumers were using cyber espionage to gain a foothold in a market or to beat out a competitor, that ability to identify the attacker and then punish them by imposing sanctions in other countries or by bringing lawsuits will enable us to actually increase the damage, the harm, the punishment that we impose on people who are attacking us through cyber espionage. So there are 3, 4 very real things we could do tomorrow to engage in punishment of people who have used cyber espionage against the United States. Why don't I stop there?
Just to show that the expertise on economic warfare does not reside entirely in Washington and the usual places that we assume, we brought in Will Scott from Colorado Springs, who's survived not only power failure, no doubt, but fire as well. Will is a former editor at Aviation Week and a former official at the National Security Agency. He's the author of a couple of books, co-author of a couple of books with the title of Space Wars. The first one of them, the subtitle is what? The first 3 minutes of World War III? First 6 hours of World War III, and the second one is, what's the subtitle?
Counter space, the next hours.
Okay, the next, all right. At any rate, let's welcome Will.
Thank you, Ken. You've seen the top-level stuff. I'm going to take you right down the weeds, or at least down in the trees. Perhaps the most simple form of economic warfare is wildland arson. That's just setting fires in U.S. forests, grasslands. So for any terrorists that are determined to inflict significant damage with very little investment, or risk fires an extremely high-leverage weapon of mass effect. And when the Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden, they captured a treasure trove of material that provided some unprecedented insight into the al-Qaeda plans. And one of those was a detailed campaign for starting fires throughout the West. And U.S. officials have pretty much determined that some of the fires that burned in California last year were ignited by al-Qaeda operatives. On May 2nd of this year, ABC News ran a story entitled Al-Qaeda Magazine Calls for Firebomb Campaign in U.S. And issues of something called Inspire magazine surfaced on al-Qaeda websites, calling for jihadists to start huge fires with timed explosives planted in U.S. forests. Now, those articles detailed instructions for constructing remote-controlled, quote, ember bombs. Now, the concept of fire wars isn't really, or just merely, a futuristic possibility confined to think tank musings. As of last Saturday, there were 52 large fires burning across the United States. 38 of them were uncontained. Since July 1st, crews have been battling fires in Colorado, Missouri, Idaho, South and North Dakota, Montana, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, Nevada, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alaska, Florida, California, Minnesota, North Carolina, Arizona, Nebraska, Alabama, Arkansas, and Georgia. And although they will cost Americans billions of dollars, those were just the fires on federal land. They don't include local and state fires, such as 6 that were started in wheat stubble fields of north central Kansas 2 weeks ago. 4 of those were started in one night. Now, those of us who live in Colorado are already engaged in fire combat. Recently, 25 fires were started within a few miles of each other in El Paso and Teller counties. Every one of them was attributed to arson, but the fire crews has extinguished all 25 of them before they caused much damage. However, the arsonist is still at large. And in early July, there were 12 large fires, major fires, burning in Colorado. 6 of those consumed 167,000 acres, and that's an area about 4.27 times the size of Washington, D.C. One, the High Point fire in northern Colorado, has burned 87,504 acres and burned and destroyed 259 homes. But the most destructive fire in Colorado history started 3 miles from my hometown of Colorado Springs on June 23rd. The Waldo Canyon fire exploded on June 26, fueled by 100-degree temperatures, relative humidities in the 2% range, and 55 to 65 mile-per-hour winds. In the span of minutes, not hours, those wind-driven flames jumped 2 fire breaks and raced down hills into the Mountain Shadows neighborhood. And thanks to exceptionally dedicated, brave firefighters, they battled a firestorm from hell, quote unquote, that ultimately destroyed 346 homes and killed 2 people, all in a few hours. Now, the Waldo Canyon fires burned 18,247 acres, forced 32,000 people to evacuate, and cost on the order of $15 million in direct costs to bring it under control. Investigators have not determined the cause yet, but we know it was not sparked by a lightning strike. The top-level questions are, was the Waldo Canyon fire started by terrorists? Did the same person or group that ignited those other 25 fires finally score on number 26? And was this part of an organized economic warfare campaign of fires across the U.S.? If it was an economic warfare attack, then the Waldo Canyon fire was a huge success. Rebuilding those 346 homes will exceed $100 million, and indirect costs will add millions more. Businesses that were evacuated estimate that their critical summertime revenues will be down 45 to 65%. The Broadmoor, a five-star luxury hotel that wasn't in any immediate danger at all, lost more than 4,000 nights through cancellations. Thousands of tourists were either driven from the mountains by evacuations or simply didn't come to Colorado Springs because they were spooked by the massive fire. One community there, Manitou Springs, has already suffered 74 job losses due to just layoffs, and insurance rates will probably rise as a result of this and hundreds of other fires across the country. Now, professional firefighters are warning that this rash of wildland fires may be just the beginning of a terrible season that could see millions more acres burned across the West. Ironically, Blue Ribbon Panel report, I was part of that back in 2002. The report we submitted 10 years ago warned of exactly this situation. Extremely dry conditions, exacerbated by forests that are choked with downed timber and standing beetle-killed trees, create ideal targets for terrorists waging economic warfare. Now, there's reason to believe that the U.S. is under attack, that the bad guys are waging fire wars right now. But we as the people aren't fighting back. And that's primarily due to an ingrained, out-of-date mindset where we still treat fire as a land management issue, and we should be treating it as a national security issue. And when we finally acknowledge that we are engaged in a brutal economic war by fire, we could adopt effective strategies to defeat terrorists who are starting those fires. We could use NASA and Defense Department satellites to spot new fires. We could fly infrared-equipped NASA, Forest Service, military aircraft over fire-prone forests, operating something you might call a fire combat air patrols around the clock, 24/7. So let's say an Air National Guard F-16 fighter equipped with a lantern or sniper electro-optic pod spots a new fire start. The pilot could immediately give firefighters its coordinates and vector the initial attack crews to the blaze. He could also track any vehicles that he might be seen leaving the area and guide law enforcement officers to intercept them. Finally, it's time. We have to develop and field a robust, large air tanker fleet of firefighting aircraft. Now, the Forest Service has made a good start, but it still suffers from a culture and an attitude of what firefighters call cheapism, the idea that we can fight wildland fire on the cheap, and that's just no longer acceptable. So America, I think, is under attack by terrorists waging economic warfare by fire. And unless we admit that truth and properly focus our considerable national resources on this enemy, U.S. citizens will suffer intolerable and completely unnecessary loss of property and life. Thank you.
Our next speaker is David Aufhauser, who's a partner at Williams & Conley and former General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. The title of his remarks are Transnational Crime, Unholy Allies to Disorder, Terror and Proliferation.
About the only encouraging thing I heard in William Scott's talk a minute ago was that there was more than 6 hours to World War III coming up. I've been asked to speak a little bit about transnational organized crime, which tries to capture, I think, General Hayden's comments about some people being sinners, and maybe tries to morph a little bit of Jim Woolsey's statement that our enemies are the rich. But in this case, these are people enriched not from oil necessarily, but principally from drugs and, of course, things like human trafficking. The point of my talk really is less about organized crime, which presents common public issues of safety, and more about the seem uniform and acceptable dynamic, which is the convergence of organized crime with terrorism and acts of insurgency. And no lesser light than Director Clapper recently testified that transnational organized crime, particularly in the Islamic Maghreb, is the abiding threat to national security in the United States. And in fact, when you go back and you take a look at the National Intelligence Council's open source global trend documents, they're really quite consistent and repeated in the warning or prediction that what we're facing in the world to come between now and 2025 is the growing emergence of non-state actors, a multipolar world without the benefits, if you will, of multilateralism, and a discord of demographics, all of which is a toxic mixture for exploitation by organized crime, and particularly cross-border exploitation of organized crime. Now, what is the threat that transnational organized crime poses to national security? The first I've already mentioned, and is pretty much straightforward. It's our common public safety, whether it's drug trafficking, human trafficking, kidnapping, intimidation and extortion, murder now on a scale that we haven't witnessed except in theaters of conflict when you think about what's happening south of the Mexican border today. Counterfeiting and the kind of cyber fraud capability of stealing your identity or emptying your bank accounts, all of these threaten our common good. All of these are rather unrevealing, obvious challenges of organized crime. But there's a second growing theater of threat that's more far-reaching and presents kind of an uncommon injury, if you will, to our national security. And that is this, what I referred to before, as the convergence or the unholy alliance of crime, terror, and insurgency. It affects us in our national security in a number of different ways. The first is the corruption of developing states. The second is capture of failing states. The third is alliances by trans-organized criminal organizations with state sponsors of terrorism. The fourth is this convergence that I've referred to you of the terrorism, crime, and insurgency, which reflects, in some cases, not so much a shared ideology, although I'll give you an example where there is a shared ideology in a second, and more so merely marriages of convenience, where crime, violence, and extortion can make both parties rich or further the political ends of terrorists. By the way, when I was at Treasury, it was immediately after 9/11, and we had to stand up what was a nascent terrorist financing organization trying to trace the source of monies. We believed at the time, and I think we were correct at the time, that the principal source of money for terrorism through a rather centralized al-Qaeda organization were the diversion of charitable funds and or direct contributions, knowing contributions from people in the Middle East. We got very good at chasing that money, extremely good at that chasing that money. And if you will, terrorists responded by seeking out other sources of money. And the other sources of money that they turned to increasingly in a balkanized, atomized world was plain old pedestrian crime. So when you looked at what happened in Madrid several years ago, close inspection proved that Madrid was not financed by international money. Madrid was a locally financed drug operation and also smuggling of people across the straits there from Morocco, financed by crime and financed by the organized criminal elements of Spain that killed scores and scores of people. So increasingly, terrorist financing concerns have focused upon the growing alliance between the funding of the terrorist activities by crime and indeed the attraction, the marquee attraction of maximizing that and leveraging it by reaching out and shaking hands with transnational organized crime. None of this is really imagined, and you have to appreciate the scope to appreciate that this is real. This is a real, current, abiding, corrosive, constant threat. It may not have the immediacy, it may not have the marquee value of talking about cyber warfare or about even fires set out in California and Arizona, but it is a constant eroding drip which actually has the capability of bringing weapons of mass destruction to our borders. There's a very interesting piece of testimony people ought to read by Douglas Farah about 2 or 3 months ago here in the Senate on the incredibly tight alliance of Iran and the Quds forces and the the Iranian Guard and FARC and the government of Chavez, and what they're standing up there, including military universities and including, quite frankly, the building or the ambition to build a nuclear plant, which is the same blueprint as the plant in Iran that has been bedeviling us now for more than 7 years. But back to the scope. You know, these numbers are imperfect, and the reason the numbers are imperfect is by definition, this is clandestine activity. This is hidden markets. This is black, dark pool money. Ironically, the anonymity of the money has additional protections by how modern a system we have now for the transfer of wealth across borders today. I don't know whether it was Michael or Jim who referred to it, but we now transfer money not less in bulk and more in X's and O's. And X's and O's sometimes are easy to follow if you have penetrated a system, like we once upon did, now publicly known, called SWIFT. But otherwise, very difficult to figure out who is sending what to whom when it's a digital transfer of huge amounts of money across borders, frequently hidden as false transactions and trade activity. Size, though, even with all those caveats. The White House's numbers in their announcement of the July 2011 strategy on transnational crime. $1 to $3 trillion in laundered accounts. $1 billion in public official bribery. $750 to $1 trillion, $750 billion to $1 trillion in drug money. Illicit weaponry sales, 170 to 320 billion. Counterfeited and pirated goods, 500 billion. Those numbers add up, if my arithmetic is right, to $6.2 billion. At the high side, the equivalent of 10% of GDP in the US. Now, World Bank estimates put it lower, but whether it's 4% or 10%, it's still a staggering amount of money. And that money is used to corrupt states and failing states to buy safe haven and to help both illicit activity and terrorist activity. Disorder favors the bad guys, the sinners that Michael was referring to. Who are these guys? Well, in Russia and Eurasia, they now go by a newly dubbed name, the Brothers Circle. In India, there's a guy named Dawood Ibrahim, who I'll speak more about, and the D Company. In Latin America, there are many cartels that you're familiar with, but the most savage and gory one is Los Cetas. In Italy, it's the Camorra. In Japan, it's one of the Yakuza crime families, the most prominent of which was recently designated by Treasury. I'm going to butcher the name, but Yamaguchi Gumi is what the name of the family is. The trade is commonplace: counterfeiting, human chattel, illicit arms trade, fraud, and above all, drugs. They use shell companies, compromise accountants, lawyers, bankers, and investment bankers, but most importantly, they corrupt public officials as they ply the trade. And perhaps more importantly, they spirit the money that they earn locally across the globe to expand their criminal enterprise. Now, these organizations, the five I named by way of example, which have been named by the Treasury Department, this isn't, Marlon Brando hierarchy, old world cartels. These are very complex, networked, loosely knit together criminal syndicate families and clans and tribes. They are allied because of the convenience of it, and they're allied, unfortunately, this is the dark side of the internet, of course, by the ease with which you can communicate, engage in social intercourse, engage in criminal intercourse, and transfer funds and logistics necessary to become a global criminal enterprise. Let me give you some examples, and I'm giving you these examples to impress upon you that there is no one model for the crime family, and there's no one model for the nexus that I'm concerned about, and that actually the current administration, which has been really on top of this, the nexus between terrorism and transnational organized crime. There's no single model. Some are marriages of convenience, some are are revolutionary fronts that have morphed to commercial criminal enterprises, and some are criminal enterprises that have morphed to revolutionary fronts. Afghanistan is the most obvious up front for all of us. The alliance with criminal networks like the Haqqani networks, who are basically responsible for many of the IED deaths that we've encountered in Afghanistan, and for the corruption of the officials, and thereby undermining the legitimacy and the capacity of the government that we're trying to stand up there. The Afghanistan exercise, however, pales in terms of its sagacity, in terms of its footprint to Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been around for years and years and years. It is now confirmed through indictments, through designations, and through intelligence that it's a major drug trafficking and money laundering organization, as well as a terrorist organization. And its reach goes from the tri-border area down in Latin America and alliances with the FARC up in the north of Latin America to West Africa and captured or near captured nations like Mali or Guinea-Bissau, and money flowing through Lebanese banks, all of which became disclosed and all of which was seriously shut down or frustrated by the efforts of the US government in the closing of what was known as the Lebanese Canadian Bank. Hezbollah's activities, there's such a long history of Hezbollah's activities in Latin America alone that it's frightening to think about. And it's all allied with the drug trade in terms of underwriting. It goes back to 1994 and the bombing of the AMIA Buenos Aires Jewish Center, which directly implicated Hezbollah and Iran. It advances as much as early or as late to December 2001, when Hamon Jumae, a Lebanese drug kingpin and Hezbollah financier, was charged with smuggling tons of US-bound cocaine in concert with the Los Zetos Mexican organized crime cartel. And then you hear, at least from open source materials, I mention this almost because it sounds like Keystone Cops, is the quixotic open source story that the Quad Iranian Revolutionary Guard allied themselves with hitmen of Los Zetas, to go after the ambassador from Saudi Arabia here in America. Gentlemen on this table may know sources that I don't have available to me. It's both stunning in its stupidity, stunning in its ambition, frightening if it does represent a willingness to kill an American through an alliance of organized crime and terrorist political activity. There's less tilting at windmills if you turn east and return to what I mentioned about a different organization, the D Company, which is in India and Pakistan. This is a criminal group that's actually transformed itself from 20 years of being the most powerful criminal network in India and Pakistan to becoming the champion of terrorist activity in the area, with direct ties and responsibility to the Mumbai bombings. Congressional reports have called this a fusion company, that is crime and terror, that numbers 5,000 people in Pakistan, India, and the UAE. It was designated originally as a global terrorist organization in 2003, but then graduated, if you will, to being designated in 2006 also as a drug kingpin operation. Its core products are extortion, smuggling, narcotics, and contract killing. It was overseen by Mr. Ibrahim throughout the 90s and became and morphed into a politically purposeful, designed criminal organization after the destruction of the Babri Mosque in Pradesh in the 1990s. That's a criminal organization that morphed into a criminal organization whose money sponsors terrorist activity. FARC is a different story. FARC was always a terrorist organization, which over time, after it was awarded 42,000 hectares of territory in an attempt by the Colombian government to assuage them and to buy some level of peace, then started promoting a drug trade which finances them today and finances the havoc that they continue to reap down in the Latin America area. So while with the old cartels that we used to read about, like the Cali cartel, seem to have been crushed. The one cartel that hasn't been crushed is FARC, and FARC continues today with close alliances to Iran. And on that point, instead of either plagiarizing or taking more time, I really recommend that you read Doug Farah's testimony of about 3 months ago on Iran's presence in Latin America and the direct national security threat it poses in its alliance with the drug trade in Latin America. Let me give you a couple of conclusions or observations. The scope, as I said, of this threat is incredibly large. It's almost unimaginable. This is more resources devoted to violence than any other non-state source. It's growing. It's growing exponentially. It undermines our international development aid. There are lots of numbers out there, but substantial, I've read substantial numbers to suggest that 30 or 40% of development aid gets in the wrong pockets, gets diverted. It goes to corrupt public officials who then harbor the activity of organized crime and terrorist activity. As I said, it threatens to bring disorder to the failing states. There is a growing literature that they're getting smart about what they do with their investments. And the smartness is to leverage their power by becoming significant forces in strategic materials and natural resources, thereby giving them leverage in those markets and thereby distorting those markets, much to our economic disadvantage. I want to leave you with one large irony about this convergence. In a world of asymmetrical warfare, and that's what this is, leverage risk from the non-state actors depends in part upon their ability to ally themselves as networks. What we have found, and what my friends and colleagues from my days at Treasury have found, ironically, is that one of the most powerful weapons against these networks is to shame them, to pick out a node in the network, to name them, to out them, to do it. It's one thing to say they're going to freeze their assets. Most of these networks don't have material assets in the U.S. to freeze. It's another thing to prohibit trade with them. Most U.S. Legitimate businesses wouldn't be trading with them anyway. It's another thing simply to name them and brand them and put the scarlet letter on them. The success that flows from that has two reasons. One is legitimate businesses will certainly shun companies. The second is their former allies in the illegitimate business are frightened of enhanced scrutiny. And so they may shy away from the alliances that they formerly had with these networks. And so the U.S. government strategy right now is to try to take down the networks by outing each individual node that's identifiable in the network. And it's actually quite a smart way to go about it. It is not a top-down, but a bottom-up erosion of their powers. If you don't break that circuitry, what's promised over the next 20 years is an enormous amount of civil disorder around the world and the prospect of an acceleration of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction at your doors.
And now, last but certainly not least, former Attorney General Mukasey. I have been thinking, especially after hearing Stewart Baker's remarks, asking the question of what's legal and what's not legal in the war on economic warfare. And I'm sure we're going to get more than a little bit of that. Thank you.
I want to thank Rachel and even in his absence, Senator Kyle, for organizing this wonderful afternoon, which I hope will have a more substantial purpose than simply a bunch of people getting together and scaring the living hell out of one another. And out of the non-participants as well. We've been talking about all manner of possible assaults, both cyber, non-cyber, state, non-state actors that could affect the economic health of this country. Because the means of conducting these assaults are so varied, and to the extent that they rely on technology constantly evolving, I think it's fair to say that the law, as we conventionally think of it, is an increasingly feeble tool with which to combat these kinds of assaults. And in fact, one of the principal lessons I'm going to draw today is that if the one thing we can do is make sure that the law stays out of the way of developments in private industry and in private industry and government cooperation. Because if you think about it, the possibly the most lawyered war that we've ever had is the current war on terror. And our experience, I think, has been that the law has been better at getting in the way of combating it than it has been at combating it. In order to understand how feckless a venture it is to try to create a set of rules that will, particularly international rules, that will control the kinds of forces that we've been talking about, I want to take you back over a century to the year 1906, when Russia, which was disadvantaged by a then new technology of hot air balloons, backed an effort to outlaw aerial bombardment. And in fact, at the first Hague Peace Conference in that year, the Russians proposed a ban on what they called the discharge of any kind of projectile or explosive from balloons or similar means for a term of 5 years, and it was adopted. The following year, when the advantages of aerial bombardment began to be perceived, the ban was reinstituted, but it applied only to undefended towns and villages, which is to say, when it came to aerial bombardment in support of conventional warfare, all the bars were down. Now, this example seems quaint, but it illustrates two approaches that are sometimes attempted to try to restrain feared military potential of advancing technology. The first is to prohibit certain kinds of activity outright, and the second is to try to limit it. There are some relatively primitive practices as to which an outright ban has been moderately successful. The use of poison gas in warfare is an example of that, but even there are, of course, some regimes that have used it both against their own people and in international struggles. Think back on the Iraq-Iran war, and you can think about the limits of international conventions of that kind. The limitation approach with respect to nuclear weapons, I think we're watching that unravel right before our eyes. I think it should be no surprise that as to the matters we've been talking about, it seems unlikely that a regimen of rules, however widely concurred in by public and private agencies, are going to limit resort to economic warfare through the various channels that are open to both state and non-state actors. Reliance on any government is at least problematic. For example, in the cybersphere, the Defense Department is authorized to act with respect to threats to the .mil and the .gov networks. It may, under some circumstances, be able to warn of a cyber attack on some part of the .com network. But as General Keith Alexander, director of the Defense Intelligence Agencies, has said, in many cases, the only thing his agency is authorized to do is to watch the screen and say, ooh, that's going to be a bad one. As to the criminal law, it punishes unlawful intrusions, unlawful damage of the sort that we've been describing, but it acts after the fact. And obviously, we want to create, ideally, a system in which people cannot act before the fact. I think private actors within the .com domain, as Stewart suggested, can certainly set up their own detection networks and keep, if we keep the legal channels sufficiently open, can cooperate with the government in strategies that will not only detect, but in some cases, punish the the hijacking of information and the destruction of systems. It's difficult to get private companies to go along with these cooperative activities. The first reaction tends to be, what about our secrets? Won't they become known to other companies? Firewalls and clean teams can get around that, and I think companies have shown themselves in recent years to be more and more receptive to that kind of activity. I think government can contribute. It does contribute in a plodding sort of way. I hadn't heard mention today of something called the CFIUS process. It's one of those splendid government acronyms. It stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's an interagency group that passes on the acquisition by foreign persons and entities of interests in U.S. companies that, for example, have defense contracts with the government. It's comprised of representatives of the Departments of Defense, Treasury, Justice, State, and Commerce at a minimum, and it passes on those foreign acquisitions. Of course, the downside is that there has to be a government hook in order to do that, and the government hook is generally a government defense contract. Obviously, the government cannot be passing on all foreign acquisitions. We live in a free society, a society that has a bias in favor of the free movement of capital and the free movement of people. But we can, it seems to me, monitor and disclose, requiring disclosure from listed companies, requiring disclosure of foreign holdings from companies that are regulated through the exchanges and otherwise, is one approach that will at least allow people like Rachel to figure out who owns what and how much. There is a bit of good news in all of this that I found plodding through the particularly dense verbiage of a book on international law. And I came upon the following passage. It says, "No international convention, to include the Charter of the United Nations, defines threat or use of force, armed force, or armed attack. And despite decades of earnest work, the international community has failed to define aggression with any clarity in any other document." And here's the bold type. "Existing international law that governs the use of force must therefore be derived from a heuristic analysis of how the Charter use of force paradigm has been interpreted through state practice." Now, believe it or not, that's actually good news, because you know what it means? What it means in plain English is, it's not what they say, it's what they do that counts, which is to say, it's not what they say, it's what we do that counts. And so long as we can focus on these problems and act freely in the international arena, we may be able to overcome some of the problems you've heard about this afternoon. Thank you very much.